Alrighty, so this presentation is going to be on cystic fibrosis for the final project for Bio 225. So just to start off, what is cystic fibrosis? Cystic fibrosis is a genetic disorder. It is actually inherited, so that means it's not something that is contagious or anything like that. You get it from your parents being carriers. The disease causes major issues with just your lungs and your digestive system. The gene that is associated with this is going to be the CFTR gene, and it has a mutation which then causes mucus to build up in the lining of your stomach and in your lungs. This makes it very hard to breathe, as you could imagine, with all the mucus in your lungs and everything. Where typically the CFTR gene, when normally operating, it does break down that mucus. It actually channels it out through these little pores that it makes with proteins. People who have cystic fibrosis typically do have a shorter lifetime than people who do not have this mutated gene, but they still can live for a fairly long time. So who can get cystic fibrosis? Cystic fibrosis is seen all around the globe. It's something that's inherited, and you see it when you are born. And it's only around 900 to 1,000 new cases every year, but just alone in the United States, there is around 30,000 people that are suffering from cystic fibrosis that it currently affects. So like I was talking about before, the CFTR gene, which is mutated, which causes cystic fibrosis, normally the way it functions is it removes that mucus that I was talking about earlier. So it does this by, it produces these little tiny channels that allow the mucus to travel across the membrane, and it makes these little proteins that's what it does. The proteins are what makes those little channels, and it causes the mucus to then be pumped across the membrane. So this is getting rid of that in our lungs and everything, where when it's mutated it doesn't, so it just keeps building up and building up, making it harder to breathe, and that is where cystic fibrosis comes into. So the mode of inheritance, it is through an autosomal recessive way. So both the parents are carriers for the gene to then be mutated and passed on into the children, and then it's expressed. So we'll get into that on the next slide, but it is autosomal recessive. So as you can see here, you have an unaffected carrier as a father and an unaffected carrier as a mother. So out of that, if you had 4 kids, as an example, we'll just go along with here. Let me move this so you can see it a little better. Hopefully that's better for you. You can see that you have your 2 parents that are both unaffected carriers, but then you have one child who's just going to be completely unaffected. They're not a carrier, they aren't affected at all. Then you'll have 2 children that are carriers, so like half of your offspring would be carriers. 1/4 would be unaffected, and then 1/4 would actually have cystic fibrosis. So that's what I mean by an autosomal recessive inheritance. So then on this next page, this is the pedigree that I actually made. Sorry, it's hard to move this. So you can see here, this is the one that I made for class, and it shows that Bryce, Mark, and Mary all actually do have cystic fibrosis. Okay, and you can see that by the little a, that means they are actually affected. Okay, so if you look at Bryce here, you can see that Natalie and Drew were both carriers with that little a. If you look at Mark, you can see that Julie and Luke were both carriers, and then if you go all the way up to the top and look at Mary, you can see that Helen and Donald were also carriers as well. So going into genetic testing options, there are quite a few, but most of them are just done by a simple blood test or saliva, which are very simple to do. They can be analyzed and then looked at. They can be looked at and see if you have that mutated CFTR gene, and they're not required, but it is highly recommended, and it doesn't even cost that much. You can get them for as low as $100 all the way up to $2,000. Many different companies offer them, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So some of the 3 major companies that do offer this genetic test is Gene by Gene, MyMedLab, and Laboratory Corporation of America. So these are just 3 of companies that do this test. There are many others out there as well. Treatments for cystic fibrosis, they include just having antibiotics. Like many of you guys have probably heard of bronchodilators. That's a medicine that's actually inhaled when you breathe it in. And there's been treatments around for a very long time, but there is no actual cure for cystic fibrosis. The treatments kind of just help the symptoms. And next, I wanted to kind of talk about this photo right here. So it kind of gives you a good picture. You can see what the healthy, smooth muscle lining looks like. And then in cystic fibrosis over there on the right, you can see all that mucus buildup, and it kind of restricts it. So you can imagine how in your lungs that would be very difficult. So that was just a little visual to show you kind of how and what cystic fibrosis really is. And on the left, you can see Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. There are many foundations out there trying to help create a cure, fund money for it, and create new treatments for it. And that's just one of the companies doing it. There are many, many, many companies out there, or organizations, not companies. And then next is just my reference slide for what I used up there. All the photos actually have their references underneath the photo. So thank you, and I hope you learned something about cystic fibrosis.